I've been asking you all over the past month which character short stories you wanted me to prioritize, and unsurprisingly, Luca Blight and Victor were the two most popular answers that I received. But the third most requested short story was for Matthew, Apple and Shoes. Before I jump into it, let's first give a little summary of the three characters. Matthew used to serve as Qasim Hazil's strategist in the Scarlet Moon Empire during the War of Succession in the solar year 446. But he became disillusioned with the Empire and resigned from his position in the solar year 448 due to the Calica incident, which was nothing more than a massacre of civilians. Following this, Matthew opened a school in Seika village where he taught children. He then took some time to travel north to the grasslands before returning to his school in Seika in the solar year 453. Among his many students were Apple and Shu. Suikoden 1 never explored anything about Apple beyond the fact that she was a student of Matthew's, but Suikoden 2 revealed a little more. Richmond's investigations revealed that her parents were killed during the war between the Scarlet Moon Empire and the city-states of Joustin. She was then given a scholarship to study at Matthew's school. She also travelled north to Harmonia to study in Crystal Valley before returning to the Scarlet Moon Empire during the events of Suikoden 1. As for Shu, all that Suikoden 2 revealed about his past was that he inherited Matthew's tactical brilliance, and that he was expelled by Matthew for using his knowledge for selfish gains. Fortunately for fans of these three characters, their backstories were expanded on in a short story titled Where Tomorrow Takes Us, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 2, a book that released in Japan in May 2001. Just to temper your expectations in advance, don't be expecting any action or big excitable moments in this short story. It takes place primarily in Matthew's school, and it's told from Apple's point of view, who's only 10 years old at the time. It's dialogue heavy, which does help flesh out the characters, and it adds some lore to the region, but it's rather uneventful as a whole. It also contains some mistakes that don't match up with the timeline and information from the games in the encyclopedia. I'll explain those issues in the story as we get to them. The story takes place in the solar year 453, which is the same year that Odessa founded the Liberation Army and the same year that Starleap takes place, which is 2 years before the events of Suikoden 1. The story begins with Matthew and Apple arriving in Seika on the back of a wagon. Apple couldn't help but notice how different the buildings looked and how differently the people in Seika were dressed compared to where she was from. Stepping off the wagon driver showed a great dislike for Matthew and told Apple to hurry up and get their own luggage as he threw her bag to the ground. A tattered book fell from her bag and pages scattered in the dirt. Apple opened her mouth, wanting to call the wagon driver out for his rude behaviour, but stopped herself when she saw Matthew shaking his head from the corner of her eye. Apple had only just recently met Matthew a few days ago, and she was worried that if she upset him, that he wouldn't allow her to stay at his home. So she held her tongue and chose to remain polite by introducing herself to the wagon driver, who dismissed her and rode away. Matthew then turned to Apple and asked her for her help in carrying his luggage to his house. As Apple and Matthew were dividing up the luggage between the two of them, she spotted numerous books in Matthew's bags. These books were unlike anything Apple had ever seen before. The only books she had ever seen looked like stacks of paper in comparison. Apple picked up one of the books, but the cover was filled with letters she couldn't recognize. Matthew told her that it was an interesting book and that she'll soon be able to read such books herself. They then heard the wagon driver laughing with another villager behind them. The wagon driver was nothing but unfriendly with them the entire journey, but there he was going door to door to every villager in town, smiling, laughing and handing over the goods they requested. Apple muttered that she wished the driver could have given them a ride to Matthew's house instead of dropping them off at the entrance to the village. Matthew laughed and gave Apple a smile. Apple got the impression that Matthew wasn't welcome in the village, as the attitude being shown to him was the same as how she was treated when she lost her parents and had to move in with her relatives. As they were walking to Matthew's house, Apple began thinking of her relatives and how she met Matthew only 3 days ago. Apple was originally from the Dana region in the north of the Scarlet Moon Empire, but she lost her parents at a young age when the city-states of Joustin invaded. As Apple was born in the solar year 443, the only war this could be referencing is when the city-states of Joustin invaded the Scarlet Moon Empire after the War of Succession. So between the solar years 447 to 448, which is around the time of the Calica incident. That's not to say she's from Calica, but she's from that region where much of the fighting took place. After losing her parents in the war, she was taken in by a distant relative who lived in Garin. While we never see it in the game except for very briefly in the background during a war battle, there's actually a fort on the north side of the bridge, and according to this short story, there's a village attached to that fortress. Apple felt like an unwanted guest in her relative's home. They already had 3 children to care for, including a baby, and with taxes increasing every year, they were barely getting by. Apple worked hard to earn her keep, but 3 days ago while she was running errands, she was secretly trying to read a book in the corner of the market. She heard a man's voice asking her if she liked books. The voice startled her and she almost dropped the book. Apple knew that if her relatives saw her slacking off and reading a book instead of doing her errands, she'd get a beating. Fortunately, when she looked up, it was Mathiu who was standing over her, and Mathiu then introduced himself. Apple spotted a book in Mathiu's bag and she asked him if he liked reading books too. Mathiu nodded and asked Apple about the book she was reading, noting that it looked like quite an old book. Apple told him it was given to her by her father around 5 years ago and that she's read it so many times that she doesn't even need to open the book anymore because she has it memorized. She then began to recite the contents of the book to Mathiu. Mathiu nodded along in agreement as if he knew the contents. He then interrupted her and praised her for her knowledge of the book. Mathiu asked her if she could recite any other books, and Apple told him that this is the only book she owns as she can't afford to buy any new books, but she wishes that she could read more. Mathiu then invited her to come to Seika with him. He told her that he has a school in Seika where he teaches children how to read and write, and that there are many books in his school. Apple, excited by the thought of being able to read to her heart's content, agreed without hesitation to come to Seika with him. The story then cuts back to Seika as Apple is walking up the steps to Mathiu's house. Apple could hear the laughter of children coming from inside the house. Mathiu then explained to Apple that he doesn't just teach children from the village, but that he also takes in orphans who are in similar situations to Apple. When Mathiu opened the door, they could see all of the children running around, laughing and screaming, with the doors covered in graffiti. But the house fell silent when Mathiu spoke. The moment the house fell silent, a door opened from the back of the house and a young man walked out. Apple hid behind Mathiu and heard the man's voice welcome Mathiu home. The young man commented that he wasn't expecting Mathiu to return until tomorrow, to which Mathiu replied that he finished his shopping trip earlier than planned. Mathiu asked how the children were while he was gone, and the young man told him that they've been like this since he left. He then asked Mathiu if the reason he returned early was because of the young girl hiding behind him. Mathiu stepped aside and introduced Apple to Shu, and told her that Shu will help her get settled in. Shu reached out his hand towards Apple. Apple was expecting a handshake, but she was left stunned when all Shu done was take the books from her hand and return to his room without saying a word. Mathiu smiled at her and told her that Shu isn't very friendly. He then offered to introduce her to the other children, but Apple was more interested in seeing the study room and looking at all of the books. Mathiu took her to the study and Apple was left stunned as the walls were lined with bookshelves full of books. Apple was filled with excitement at the thought of being able to read as many books as she wanted. Mathiu then told her that when she learns more letters that she'll be able to read entire books. Mathiu then brought Apple to the classroom to introduce her to the other students. The room fell silent as Mathiu walked in. The children welcomed Mathiu back, and Mathiu commented that since they're all having so much fun, then surely their homework must be finished. One by one, the students approached Mathiu with their homework, and Mathiu praised them for a job well done while correcting their mistakes. Mathiu then asked the children if they were forgetting something, and he reminded the students that all who hadn't finished their homework will have to wake up extra early tomorrow and pull the weeds out of the garden. Mathiu then introduced Apple to the class. The children applauded and welcomed Apple. The welcome she received from the students made Apple's cheeks burn bright red. The children then surrounded Apple and began hounding her with curious questions about where she was from and what it was like. After speaking to them for a while, she found out that most of the students were orphans from similar situations as herself. Shortly after, a student named Finn gave Apple a tour of Seika village while she was sent on an errand by Mathiu. Finn told Apple that while Mathiu is kind, he gets mad if you skip your studies and that he'll make you work hard to earn your keep. Since there were so many people living under one roof, all of the students had to help with the chores to ease the burden. Finn then told Apple that not everybody in Seika is as kind as Mathiu is. The two then entered the item store. Apple immediately lowered her voice the moment they entered the item shop as she spotted the man from the wagon inside. The man turned to Apple and Finn with a look of disgust. The shopkeeper then had a troubled look on his face as if he was expecting problems. All of the other customers then fell silent and turned to look at Apple and Finn. Ignoring everybody in the shop, Finn approached the shopkeeper and asked for the items that Mathiu had requested. As the shopkeeper reached for the items, the man from the wagon approached Apple and Finn, exclaiming that there's nothing to sell people like them in this village and that it'd be better if they went somewhere else. The shopkeeper meekly replied that anybody who pays is a customer. Apple stepped forward and asked the shopkeeper to please sell them the goods. The wagon driver then told the shopkeeper that if he sells anything to her, that he'll never shop here again. He then turned to Apple and Finn and said that if they really want the items, that he'd be willing to buy it all for them, but that they'd have to pay him 1,000 poch for his services. He then pressed his hand on Apple's shoulder and pushed her down to the floor. Finn called out Apple's name in a sobbing voice. The shopkeeper and the customers around the store had mixed reactions. Some of the customers were grinning in agreement with the wagon driver. The others looked disgusted by his actions, but none of them offered any help. A child's voice could then be heard coming from the entrance of the shop. Ko and Aya, two fellow students from Mathiu's school, had arrived. Aya, who was only 5 years old, ran over to Finn and Apple while crying. Ko stood between the three of them and the wagon driver and began berating him, asking him, is this how men of Seika treat children? Is this what a man does? The man told Ko that he didn't know what the hell he was talking about and that he doesn't know what these orphan children do. Ko responded by saying that orphans don't want to do those things, that they have to resort to behaving that way because adults like him treat them so coldly and so poorly. Ko then asked the man, wouldn't you hate it if the next baby was born into those circumstances? The wagon driver was choked up for words and had no response, so he made a petty remark and left the store. Some of the customers who agreed with him also left the store. Many people in Seika and the surrounding villages were prejudiced against orphan children, as many of them had to resort to petty theft just to survive. This meant they were often shunned and treated poorly wherever they went. Some people in the village took pity on their circumstances, but most people resented them. In the past, some orphans had stolen things from the villagers in Seika, and the fact that Mathiu took in orphans made many of the villagers distrustful of him. Finn then handed Mathiu's shopping list to the shopkeeper, who went to gather the requested items. Aya clung to Apple while sobbing and saying sorry, but her tears turned to a smile when Apple reassured her that she was okay. The shopkeeper then handed Finn the requested goods for a total of 200 poch. Apple asked Ko why most of the other children here have a hard time except for him and Aya. Unlike the other students, Ko and Aya weren't orphans. Their parents owned a store in the village and sent them to Mathiu's school to receive an education. Ko explained that he used to make bad assumptions about orphans too, but after listening to Mathiu, he realized that not everybody is the same and it's wrong to make assumptions. The story then cuts back to the school sometime later. In addition to giving the children a general education, Mathiu would often tell them stories about the towns and villages scattered throughout the empire and explain the history behind them. Mathiu tried his best to avoid talking about wars with the children, but sometimes the topic was unavoidable, and he always had a look of bitterness and regret on his face whenever he was forced to talk about such things. He tried to explain to the children that war comes at a great cost, but not all war is bad, as sometimes a war can be fought for meaningful reasons with a good outcome. The children were too young to understand what he meant. They couldn't understand how something good could come from a war, as all they knew of war is how they lost their families and their homes. Mathiu tried explaining to them that it's up to them to decide right from wrong, good from bad, that he's there to teach them, and as they learn, they need to think for themselves. He explained that the answer they seek may not always immediately reveal itself, and that what they thought to be right might prove to be wrong much later. Mathiu had a look of distress on his face as he spoke, as if he was remembering his time serving in the Imperial Army. He told the children that if they think they are right, they should be proud, but if they think they're wrong and that they made a mistake, they should atone and change course. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 begins just over a month later. Mathiu had been having difficulty teaching Apple. She was a slow learner, but she was starting to pick things up and show promise. Apple had been spending most of her free time in the study reading books, but while doing her chores over the past month, Apple seemed to develop a talent for cooking as she enjoyed cooking with vegetables. She also got along well with the other students. Apple found Mathiu's home to be a comfortable place to live, and she enjoyed everything about living there, except for the presence of one person. She found Shu to be rather snobbish and stuck up. According to Ko, Mathiu arrived in Seika one day with Shu alongside him. Ko thought he was Mathiu's assistant, as Mathiu would often send Shu to Gregminster to purchase books as he didn't like going there himself. Shu would also look after the children when Mathiu was away, but in contrast to Mathiu, who was attentive and always treated the children with a smile, Shu rarely got involved with the children and let them run amok. Despite living in the same house for over a month, Apple had barely spoken a word to Shu outside of the classroom, and all of the other children were afraid to speak to him except for when it was absolutely necessary. Unlike Mathiu's more relaxed teaching methods, when Shu had to teach a class, the atmosphere was quite different and all of the children felt suffocated. One day while in class, Mathiu and Shu had stuck a map of the Scarlet Moon Empire to the wall and began teaching the children about the Empire and the different places within it. While the students were looking all over the map with great interest, there was one thing that Apple couldn't stop thinking about. When the lesson was finished, Apple asked if she could take a closer look at the map. Mathiu asked her what for, and Apple pointed towards the island in the middle of Lake Torin and asked why there's nothing there. Mathiu replied that an old castle stands there, but Apple was curious why a market had never been built there. She explained her idea to Mathiu. Since Lake Torin is the centre of the Empire, if you built a market there, then everybody would have to travel an equal distance to trade. Shu, who had been listening to the two talking, then approached Apple and asked her how she noticed it was the centre of the Empire. Apple explained the concept of a circle, which they had been taught in yesterday's lesson. Mathiu and Shu then looked at each other. Apple then heard Finn call out to her, who told her that Ko had brought a lot of rare food from home and that the children were planning on having a feast. Later that night, Apple was awoken in the middle of the night by Ko banging on the front door and calling out for Mathiu in a panicked voice. Apple jumped up out of bed and hurried to the front door. She told Ko that Mathiu left earlier that evening to visit Kaku village. She asked Ko what was wrong, what brought him here in such a panic in the middle of the night. Ko told her that his sister Aya had eaten a strange plant and now she's in a lot of pain. Apple then spotted Ko's father walking towards the house with Aya in his arm wrapped in a blanket. Aya's face looked pale, her breathing was heavy and her forehead was burning up. Apple didn't know what to do. There were no doctors in the village and Mathiu was away. Ko was becoming even more panicked, fearing that his sister might die. Ko then asked if Shu was here, that maybe he could help. Apple ran to Shu's room and started banging on the door before rushing inside, but Shu was nowhere to be found as he was out on one of his late night walks. The commotion had woken up all of the other students, who started gathering around the door. The younger students began to cry when they saw the condition Aya was in. Apple was frozen and Ko began asking her if there was anything she could do, that she reads more books than everyone else. He then grabbed Apple and started shaking her. Apple wondered if they could travel to Kaku to find Mathiu or to Kuan to find a doctor, but the distance was too far. She then closed her eyes, trying to remember the contents of the books she had read. The word milk popped into Apple's head. She remembered reading that certain plants shouldn't be eaten and recalled something about milk. She told Ko's father to try and make Aya vomit and sent Ko and the eldest students out into the village to fetch some milk while the younger students prepared a bed for Aya. Apple went inside the kitchen to prepare a bowl for the milk and saw Shu standing inside. Apple was shocked to see him and told him what was happening. Shu responded that he knew what happened and asked Apple if she knew what Aya ate and if she knows what kind of poison it is. Apple confusingly asked Shu, "Poison?" Shu then handed Apple a pot of heart-shaped leaves and told her to boil it and have Aya drink it. He told Apple that it's okay to give Aya milk, but that she needs to drink this first as it has a detoxifying effect. Shu then left the kitchen and Apple heard the sound of his bedroom door closing. Apple began boiling the pot of leaves and the smell was so bad it made her want to throw up. She wondered why anyone would want to drink this and why Shu had given it to her, as she was sure the book she read said to use milk. Apple gave Aya the medicine and an hour later Aya had improved considerably. Ko and his father repeatedly thanked Apple. Everyone thought that Apple was responsible for saving Aya's life, but Apple couldn't accept their gratitude as she only followed Shu's instructions. Apple asked Aya and Ko's father what she had eaten and then went to the study room to find a book about plants. She opened up a thick book and found information about the plant. It was a poisonous plant that grows around the Seika area and the listed symptoms were exactly the same as what Aya was suffering. Apple continued reading about the plant and how to treat the poison. She was shocked to see that the plant leaves Shu had given her were the exact leaves needed to treat the poison, and that milk wasn't mentioned in the list of treatments for this particular plant. If Apple had given her milk to treat the poison, Aya may not have made it through the night. Apple made her way out of the study and spotted Shu sitting next to Aya's bed reading a book. Shu greeted her with a wry smile and asked Apple to wipe the sweat off Aya's forehead. Apple wondered why he didn't do it himself, but as she approached, she spotted Aya's hand firmly gripping Shu's arm. Apple wiped Aya's head with a wet towel while apologizing to Shu. Shu asked her what she was apologizing for, and Apple responded that she was sure she was absolutely right about the milk. Shu explained to her that there are many different types of poisons, and there are different ways to treat each poison. He told her that in this particular case she was mistaken, and that her mistake could have led to Aya's death. But she was right about there being a way to use milk to detoxify someone's body. He commended Apple for trying to make use of her knowledge, but advised her to continue studying. Apple then felt that maybe Shu wasn't as cold as everyone thinks he is. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 starts with an impossible 3-year time skip that breaks the timeline of Suikoden 1. This puts the remainder of the story taking place in the solar year 456, which isn't possible for a number of reasons. Suikoden 1 takes place between the solar years 455 to 457. By this point in time, we should be about halfway through the events of Suikoden 1, and Mathiu would have already joined the Liberation Army, but in this short story, he's still teaching at a school in Seika, and the events of the game haven't even begun yet because a certain character who shouldn't be alive appears in Chapter 4. Here's a page from the Genso Suikoden Kiwami Encyclopedia, which is the official Suikoden encyclopedia released by Konami in Japan in 2010. It's also the very same encyclopedia that's used by Suikoden IP director Takahiro Sakiyama as a reference for everything about the series. Page 844 shows the timeline of the Gate Rune War. This is a rough translation, not word for word. Solar Calendar 453. Odessa Silverberg forms the Liberation Army. The Gate Rune War begins in the Scarlet Moon Empire. Solar Calendar 455. Odessa Silverberg is killed during a raid on the Liberation Army's hideout, and MacDull takes over as the new leader. Solar Calendar 456. As part of Mathiu Silverberg's strategy, the forces of South Window and Tinto occupy the northern regions of the Empire. Solar Calendar 457. The Scarlet Moon Empire is defeated by the Liberation Army led by MacDull. The Tauren Republic is formed and LePont is appointed as the first president. And here's the timeline from page 99 of the Suikoden Marugoto guidebook, an official reference book that released in Japan in 2007. The timeline is the exact same as the encyclopedia. So you see how it's not possible for this short story to have a 3-year time jump, as we should be in the middle of the events of Suikoden 1 at this point. And if you're thinking, oh, this short story was released in 2001 and the Marugoto wasn't released until 2007 and the Kiwami Encyclopedia in 2010, maybe the timeline wasn't established yet? Well, here's the timeline from the Suikoden 1 and 2 official world guidebook that released in Japan in 1999, which contained the exact same timeline with the exception of the entry for 455, which is absent. I probably went a bit overboard with all of that, but I just wanted to give a thorough explanation as to why the 3-year time skip is impossible. Anyway, I've wasted enough time on this. Back to the story, but I'm going to ignore the time skip. Chapter 3. Sometime following the incident in which Apple and Shu saved Aya's life, the people of Seika began treating Mathiu and his students differently. The villagers were no longer mistreating the children, and Mathiu and his students were now able to freely purchase the supplies they needed without having to travel to distant towns. The number of children attending Mathiu's school had also increased, but the lessons remained the same. None of the new students were left behind, as the work the students were given were assigned individually based on their ability. When Apple first arrived at the school, she could only read simple letters from children's books, but since dedicating herself to her studies, she was now able to read far more complex books. She also excelled at arithmetic, finding the subject to be quite easy. As Apple and Finn were tending the garden, Finn asked her many questions about what she plans to do in the future. She told Apple that she's the smartest student in the school and that she's always picking Mathiu and Shu's brains. Finn wondered if Apple might become a scholar or if she planned to go to Gregminster. Apple replied that she wants to stay in Seika, that she doesn't want to go anywhere else. Later that day during class, Mathiu presented the students with a math problem to solve. He told them that this was today's work and that they should spend the whole day solving it. He then informed them that he won't be taking any questions, that they need to solve this by themselves, and when they're finished, they should bring it to Shu. He then left the room. The students all looked at their paper in confusion, which soon turned to frustration. Ko threw his pen in frustration, stating there's no way he can do this since they'd never learned anything like this. One by one, the students all gave up and instead chose to start playing. Only Apple remained focused on the work. She thought there's no way Mathiu would give them a problem they couldn't solve. Apple eventually solved the problem and all of the students looked on in excitement. Apple made her way to Shu's room as instructed by Mathiu. Shu expected Apple to solve the problem, but he was surprised she solved it so fast. He then asked Apple if she'd ever heard of a city called Crystal Valley. Shu explained to her that Mathiu once studied there when he was young, and that if she went there she could receive the best education. He revealed that today's work was a test to see if she had what it took to go to Crystal Valley. Shu told her that it would be a waste of her talent to remain in Seika studying at such a small school, but that if she went to Crystal Valley she could hold a good position within the Empire or even become a strategist in the Imperial Army. Apple responded no, that she didn't like the idea and that she wished to remain here in Seika. Shu replied by telling her how important education is and that Mathiu is only able to send one student to Crystal Valley with a letter of recommendation. Apple once again rejected Shu. She continued by telling him that she's been reading many history books and that she hates military strategists because of their involvement in war. Apple still had nightmares about what happened to her village. Neither the Empire nor the city-states cared about the village, and it was a strategist who chose that location as the battlefield. Shu tried to tell her that knowledge can be used as a weapon, that it can be more powerful than a sword, but before he could finish telling her that it could also be used as a shield, Apple cut him off by exclaiming that she doesn't need that knowledge, that Mathiu told her to think for herself and that she'll never think violence is the right answer. Shu averted his gaze and revealed to Apple that Mathiu used to be a strategist in the Imperial Army and that he's legendary for his strategies that led the Imperial Army to victory. Apple didn't want to believe him. She couldn't believe that the man who took her in and gave her a home, the man who was teaching her, was the same man responsible for the battle which took the lives of her family. So it's never actually stated in the story whether it was Mathiu who was responsible. These were just Apple's thoughts, but there's a 50-50 chance it was either Mathiu or his uncle Leon. Apple then ran out of Shu's room and crawled into her own bed. Finn came looking for her when dinner was ready, but Apple said she wasn't hungry. Shu must have told Mathiu about what happened, as Finn told her that Mathiu was worried about her. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The next day, a woman visited the school looking for Mathiu. None of the students had ever seen her before, and it was the first time any of them had seen a woman coming to visit Mathiu, which made them all curious. When Mathiu saw her, he was stunned. He looked as if he was meeting with someone he shouldn't be seen with. The two went to Mathiu's room to speak privately. The children succumbed to their curiosity and ever so gently opened the door just enough to peek through. In addition to Mathiu and the woman, they could also see Shu inside the room. Eavesdropping on their conversation, the children found out that the woman's name was Odessa. Mathiu asked her how she knew where he was. Odessa replied that she heard there was a smart and eccentric man living in Seika and that she figured it must have been him. Mathiu had already figured out why she came, and Odessa asked him to join the Liberation Army. Apple and Co looked at each other. They had heard there were people rebelling against the Empire, but they had never heard of the Liberation Army. Apple figured that if what Shu told her about Mathiu was true, then Mathiu would be sought after by not only the Imperial Army, but their enemies too. Odessa explained to Mathiu that their numbers are still small, and all they can do right now is attack Imperial transports, but word is starting to spread, and little by little their strength is growing. She then told him that when they gather enough people, they're going to need someone like him to lead them into battle. Mathiu rejected Odessa without hesitation. He told her he stepped away from war and he refuses to be complicit in it. Odessa tried to convince Mathiu by reminding him of how corrupt the Empire is and how its people suffer, including the many children in his school. Mathiu fell silent. He knew her words were true, but he despised war. Shu spoke in his place, stating that some people believe the Empire can't be helped and that rebellion would result in many more people losing their homes and their lives. Odessa tried once again to convince Mathiu to help by saying she needs his help to end the war quickly while ensuring the least number of casualties. Mathiu again rejected her request. The children then stormed the room and Apple stood between Mathiu and Odessa. The children all began telling Odessa to go away, that Mathiu doesn't like violence and he's not going anywhere. Apple hated Mathiu's past as a military strategist, but she liked what Mathiu had become. A man who hated war so much that he didn't even want to speak of it. On the verge of tears, Apple joined in with the rest of the students and demanded that Odessa leave. Odessa apologized to the children and stared Mathiu in the eyes. She told Mathiu that running away won't absolve him of his past sins and that he's a coward for turning a blind eye to the suffering that's happening. Odessa said her farewell and left the room. Apple noted the look of sadness on Odessa's face and followed her out of the room. She asked Odessa what she meant by Mathiu being able to end battles quickly while reducing casualties. Apple was under the impression that war happens because of strategists. Odessa smiled at Apple and told her that war happens even if you don't want it to. She explained that strategists don't exist to make battles worse. They exist to help win battles in ways that minimize the loss of life while protecting as many people as they can. Odessa then took her leave. Apple was in disbelief. She never knew the true role of a strategist. She had no idea that they weren't the cause of wars or that they tried to end them with as few casualties as possible. Apple returned to the dorm room where all of the youngest children were crying, fearing that Mathiu would leave them, but Mathiu reassured them that he was staying. Apple was happy that Mathiu chose to stay, and she looked at Shu thinking he'd be relieved too, but Shu had a look of dissatisfaction on his face. Later that day, Apple headed to Mathiu's room and found Mathiu and Shu facing each other in silence. The tension was high and neither of them noticed that Apple had entered the room. Shu broke the silence with a loud sigh and revealed his disappointment that Mathiu had truly quit as a strategist. At the time, Shu wasn't aware that Mathiu and Odessa were siblings, but he knew the two were very close, and he called Mathiu cruel for not just refusing to help her, but for refusing to even consider it. Shu commented that without a strategist, they have no chance against the Imperial Army, especially if Teo MacDull marches against them. Apple was stunned by Shu's words. She realised Odessa never said that she wouldn't fight without Mathiu's help. Mathiu replied to Shu that Odessa lives her life the way she chooses to. Shu then asked if they should contact the Imperial Army and informed them that the rebel leader was here in Seika. Apple called out Shu's name. Shu glanced at her but turned his attention back to Mathiu, and commented that if the soldiers came here to Seika, they'd suspect all of the villagers of harboring rebels and they'd do whatever it took to find Odessa, even if they had to kill the villagers and burn their homes to the ground. That not even Seika's children would be safe, and how many more orphans would be made. Apple called out to Shu, asking him why he'd say such a thing. Shu once again looked at Apple, but his cold tone stayed the same as he spoke. He told Apple that if war continues, it won't just be Seika that's at risk. Other villages will get involved, and if you let your emotions get in the way, the damage and suffering will only increase. Mathiu finally spoke. He told Shu that he's exactly like a man he knows. An exceptionally talented strategist, but one who believes that you can make any sacrifice as long as the gains were bigger. Shu responded that he knows the man Mathiu speaks of, his uncle Leon Silverberg, and that he agrees with Leon's methods of winning as swiftly as possible no matter the cost in order to prevent a protracted war and to minimize long-term suffering. The two argued back and forth. Mathiu told Shu that he knows he wants to become a strategist, and he reminds Shu of how talented he is, but that he has no experience with war. Mathiu then tried to explain to Shu the heavy burden of carrying around the loss of life. Apple, who was watching silently, didn't know whose side to pick. She felt that Odessa and Shu were right, but that Mathiu knew better, and that's why he now lives as he does. Shu then remarked that he made a mistake studying under Mathiu and left the room. Apple asked Mathiu to stop him, but Mathiu replied there was nothing he could do and to let him go. Apple chased after Shu and ran into his room. As Shu was packing his bags, he smiled at Apple and told her that he and Mathiu have chosen different paths. He told Apple that when he first came here, Mathiu had already left the Imperial Army and he opened this school to show children a better way forward. Shu then finished explaining to Apple what they were talking about the other day, that the knowledge a strategist possesses is not only a weapon, but that it can be used to save people. Shu stayed with Mathiu for so long because he initially thought that Mathiu had the right idea, but he now realizes that's not true. He assured Apple that he won't report Odessa's presence to the Imperials, but also told her that he won't join the Liberation Army even though he understands their cause. He believed that in their current state, they have no hope of winning and he won't throw his life away in vain. He regrets not being able to see his teacher skills up close in battle, and that his coldness just now was his attempt to convince Mathiu to help. Apple asked him what he was planning to do now, and Shu replied that he was going to go to the city-states of Joustin as he heard of a town where trade is thriving and that he wanted to test his talents at trading. He then told Apple to think about today and if she thinks he's right, to come visit him anytime. He then patted Apple on the head and left. So this is another issue with this short story. If you remember in Suikoden 2, Apple and Shu talked about how Mathiu expelled Shu for using his knowledge for selfish reasons. But in this short story, Shu left on his own accord due to ideological differences. So that makes two big mistakes in this short story, the impossible time skip and the reason for Shu's departure. A week later, Finn was speaking to Apple about Shu. Finn commented that while Shu was very cold, he was also pretty cool and smart. She then tells Apple that she wishes she could have been Shu's wife. Apple listened to Finn with a smile, but she was distracted by her thoughts of what happened between Mathiu, Shu and Odessa. Apple had spent the last week thinking about the events of that day, and she was struggling to figure out who was right and who was wrong. Apple excused herself and went to go see Mathiu. She had finally made up her mind about what she wanted to do. Apple hated war and the suffering that it caused, but she hoped to be able to use her knowledge to minimize casualties. She now knew that in order to advance her studies, she couldn't remain in Seika. As she stood in front of Mathiu's room, she wondered how Mathiu would react when she told him that she wanted to study in Crystal Valley. She then knocked on Mathiu's door as the story comes to an end. And that's it from Mathiu, Apple and Shu's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled Where Tomorrow Takes Us from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 2 that released in Japan in May 2001. About the two mistakes in this short story, the impossible time skip and Shu's departure. While these short stories do largely adhere to the lore of the games, they sometimes contain continuity errors, inconsistencies and timeline mistakes. The reason for that is because none of these short stories were written by Yoshitaka Murayama. There were 24 short stories across 4 books in this collection, which were written by 8 different authors between 2000 to 2002. During this time period, Murayama was working on the Suikoden games, Suikoden card stories, and Suikoden 3. As well as those, there was also the Suikoden 1 and 2 novelizations, 16 issues of the Genso Shinso magazine, and the 3 Suikoden Alliance Brunch and Caravel comics, all of which were written by numerous different authors. Then there was the original encyclopedia that only covered Suikoden 1 and 2, Suikoden Volume 1 and 2, and Suikoden card stories, and there was also the physical Suikoden card stories trading card game with the card stories visual book. This was the golden age period for Suikoden, where they were pumping out material at a lightning pace. Now, I don't presume to know what was going on behind the scenes, but that's an insane amount of work for one person to oversee. I imagine he was so busy with the games that he merely glossed over the books and magazines and gave them a thumbs up. That's assuming, of course, that he was even involved with anything outside of the games. Basically, what I'm saying is, the books do sometimes contain information that's inconsistent with the information in the games. So treat these short stories and all of the other books, the anime, the stage play, everything else, as supplemental to the games. Pluck out the information that doesn't contradict the games and ignore what does. Anyway, if there are any other character short stories you want me to cover, let me know in the comments below. You can find a list of all characters who receive short stories in the pinned comment. Or if there are any other Suikoden related topics or non-Suikoden related topics that you want me to make videos on, do let me know. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.